Tonight, we take you on a journey into one of the darkest chapters in American history, a tragic tale of survival, desperation, and the brutal limits of human endurance. As sleep takes you, let history unfold in the shadows of the Sierra Nevada, where the Donner Party's dream of reaching California turned into a nightmare of isolation, starvation, and unthinkable choices. If you love these sleep time history videos, make sure to subscribe and tell us where you're listening from and what time it is in the comments. We love knowing how far across the world these stories reach. Now, close your eyes and let the past guide you. The 1840s was a time of unrestrained ambition and westward expansion, an era where the American people believed they were destined to push beyond the boundaries of civilization and lay claim to the untamed wilderness that stretched to the Pacific. Manifest destiny, the deeply rooted belief that Americans were divinely chosen to spread their culture, government, and ideals across the continent, drove thousands into the unknown, pulling families from the relative comfort of the eastern states into the vast frontier that promised opportunity, but also unforgiving hardship. The promise of rich farmland, economic prosperity, and a chance to forge a new life lured settlers westward, convincing them that the risks of the journey were worth the rewards. The Oregon Trail became the artery of expansion, guiding travelers toward the fertile valleys of Oregon. But for many, the dream extended even further, to California, a land described in glowing terms, where gold, fertile soil, and a climate unlike any other in America awaited those brave enough to make the trek. California's allure grew stronger with each passing year. The land was said to be overflowing with resources, ripe for settlement, and capable of transforming even the poorest families into prosperous landowners. It was a dream that many chased, but few truly understood. For the journey was not merely a test of endurance, it was a battle for survival. The roads westward were harsh, unpredictable, and filled with dangers ranging from disease and accidents to hostile encounters with native tribes and the merciless wrath of nature itself. Yet, despite these risks, caravans of wagons continued to roll toward the Pacific, their occupants filled with hope, determination, and the belief that hardship was merely the price of a better future. Among these ambitious pioneers were the Donner and Reed families, two groups determined to carve out their own piece of California's promised land. George Donner, a seasoned traveler and farmer, had heard countless stories of California's wealth and opportunity, and he, like many others, was eager to escape the crowded and increasingly competitive farmlands of Illinois. Accompanying him was his wife, Tamsin, his daughters, and various hired hands, all prepared to face the arduous journey for a future filled with possibility. Alongside him was James Reed, a wealthy and ambitious man who sought more than just land. He wanted status, influence, and the ability to establish himself among California's elite. Reed's family, including his wife Margaret, and their children, made the journey not just in search of fortune, but in the hope of escaping personal struggles back home, including debts and the growing resentment of their neighbors. Their wagon was lavish compared to others, carrying fancy furniture, supplies meant for comfort rather than just survival, and resources that suggested a man traveling not as a pioneer, but as a future leader in California's high society. As the Donner and Reed families prepared their journey, they joined forces with other hopeful settlers, forming what would become one of the most infamous groups in the history of westward expansion. The Donner-Reed Party, bound together by a shared dream, but ultimately doomed by one fateful decision that would turn their expedition into one of the greatest tragedies in American history. Their path forward seemed clear and promising, yet a single miscalculation a reckless gamble on an unproven shortcut, would doom them to the merciless grip of winter and force them into horrors beyond imagination. The Donner Reed Party was formed not by chance, but by ambition, a collection of families and individuals bound together by one singular goal: to claim a future in California, a land untouched by the struggles of the East. At its heart stood two leading figures, George Donner and James Reed, men who, though different in background and motivation, shared the same dream of westward expansion. George Donner, a respected farmer in his 60s, had spent his life cultivating the land, building his estate, and securing his family's prosperity. But the pull of California had proved too strong to ignore. The promise of fertile soil, a new beginning, and the chance to live without competition from rising populations in Illinois convinced him that now was the time to leave. Though older than many of the pioneers who made the journey, he was determined, gathering his wife Tamsin, his 5 daughters, and various hired hands, forming his own small party within the larger group. He was not a reckless man. He had traveled west before, but California was different. It was the dream that had eluded him, the frontier that had called him with more force than any other place before. James Reed, on the other hand, was not simply a farmer seeking a peaceful life. He was a man of wealth, status, and deep ambition. Born in Ireland, and later settling in Illinois, Reed had built his fortune through land speculation, business deals, and the careful cultivation of influence. Unlike Donner, who sought stability, Reed wanted power. California represented more than land. It was a place where men of wealth could rise beyond their station, where the political elite was still forming, and where a man like Reed could carve his legacy among them. He gathered his wife, Margaret, their children, and his hired team, filling their wagon not just with supplies for survival, but luxuries. Fine furniture, ornate goods, resources meant to impress rather than simply sustain. In many ways, Reed's journey was one of opportunity rather than necessity. But his desire to be among California's great men would lead him toward a fate far different than the one he had imagined. Beyond the Donner and Reed families, others joined the party. The Breen family, led by Patrick Breen, with his wife and 7 children, became part of the group, bringing a sense of tight familial unity and determination. The Murphy family, Eddy family, and several smaller groups, including young bachelors, hoping to find their fortune, filled the wagons that would set out on their journey. Each person carried their own dreams, their own reasons for leaving behind the East. Whether it was the promise of gold, the escape from debt, or simply the lure of adventure, all were drawn toward California with the confidence of pioneers who believed hardship was temporary and triumph inevitable. Their departure from Independence, Missouri, in the spring of 1846, was filled with excitement, optimism, and a sense of unity. The wagons were loaded with supplies, food, tools, livestock, everything they believed was necessary for the long journey ahead. Children laughed as they rode alongside their families. Women chatted about the new homes they would build, and the men spoke of the opportunities that awaited them once they reached their destination. Spirits were high, confidence unshaken, and though the journey ahead would be arduous, few among them doubted their ability to overcome it. Yet, beneath the surface of their joyous departure, the seeds of misfortune were already planted. The roads west were not forgiving, the distances longer than anticipated, and the promise of shortcuts. Dangerous gambles taken in the name of speed would soon lead them toward their darkest chapter. As the wagons rolled forward, leaving Missouri behind, The pioneers looked toward the horizon, eager for the adventure ahead, unaware that their journey would become one of the greatest tragedies ever told. The Donner Reed Party departed Independence, Missouri, in the spring of 1846, riding west with a sense of purpose, hope, and boundless optimism. Their minds filled with visions of California's promised riches and fertile lands. The wagons creaked beneath the weight of their supplies. Horses snorted as they pulled forward, and the pioneers, men, women, and children alike, pressed toward the frontier with unshaken confidence. They followed the well-worn trails, forging ahead under the open sky, through rolling plains and shallow rivers, watching the landscape slowly shift as they moved further from the familiar comforts of settled towns and into the vastness of the unknown. Spirits were high, excitement buzzed in every conversation, and each morning was greeted with laughter, song, and the determination to push ahead toward a future that gleamed in their imagination. The idea of hardship felt distant, like something that belonged to other, less prepared travelers, and within the caravan, there was little doubt that their planning, their supplies, and their resolve would see them through. Yet, the journey was not without difficulty. As the days stretched into weeks, the realities of overland travel began to settle in. Wagons broke, forcing long hours of repair under the blazing sun. Oxen struggled to pull the heavy loads, their hooves worn down by miles of rocky terrain, and the simple routines of daily life. Cooking, cleaning, tending to injuries and illness became exhausting work, draining their strength little by little. While the initial excitement remained, cracks in their idealized vision of the journey slowly emerged, and they began to understand that California's bounty would not be reached without sacrifice. Food supplies were rationed more carefully, water was never guaranteed, and unpredictable elements, storms, flooding, blistering heat, created obstacles they hadn't fully anticipated. They pressed on, trusting in the well-mapped trails, believing that every struggle was temporary, every hardship a mere test of their endurance. But the seeds of their eventual suffering had already been sown, and though they couldn't yet see it, their fate had already begun to shift toward catastrophe. It was during this early stage that one critical decision set them on their doomed path. The choice to take Lansford Hastings' shortcut, a supposed faster route through the Wasatch Mountains and Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings, a writer and land promoter, had promised an easier way west, a path that would bypass the traditional routes and cut weeks off their journey. His words spread among the pioneers, reaching the Donner Reed Party, offering them the lure of a quicker passage into California. They didn't yet know that Hastings' shortcut was no shortcut at all. It was a gamble, a deadly mistake. A path that would lead them into terrain far worse than anything they had encountered so far, ultimately sealing their fate. Lansford Hastings was a man of ambition, a self-proclaimed pathfinder, a promoter of grand possibilities, and a figure who believed in bold shortcuts through the vast frontier. Eager to leave his mark on westward expansion, Hastings had written The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, a book filled with promises and advice for those daring enough to make the trek. Within it, he proposed a new route westward, a supposed shortcut through the Wasatch Mountains and Great Salt Lake Desert, bypassing the well-traveled road that had safely guided emigrants for years. Hastings argued that his cutoff would save settlers valuable time, allowing them to reach California weeks earlier than the traditional route. But in reality, the terrain was brutal, the path untested, and his promise was nothing more than reckless optimism. By the time the Donner Reed party reached Fort Bridger. The allure of Hastings' shortcut had spread among the pioneers. Other groups, convinced by Hastings' words, had already opted for the unproven path, and the Donner, Reed party, eager to save time, chose to follow. Hastings himself had not travelled the entire route, leaving behind written directions and vague assurances that the shortcut was passable. What they didn't know was that Hastings had vastly underestimated the dangers ahead, the sheer difficulty of the terrain, and the time it would take to navigate the wilderness that stretched beyond Fort Bridger. As the party moved toward the Wasatch Mountains, the weight of their decision became painfully clear. The passage was treacherous, filled with dense forests, rocky ridges, and unforgiving slopes that slowed their progress to a crawl. Wagons tipped and broke, their wheels splintering under the pressure of the uneven ground. Families struggled to push forward, cutting through thick brush, forging across streams, and hauling their supplies over near vertical inclines. Every step forward felt like a battle, and the days dragged into weeks, consuming far more time than anticipated. But the worst was yet to come. After barely escaping the Wasatch Mountains, they entered the Great Salt Lake Desert, a barren, sun-scorched wasteland that would test them in ways they had never imagined. Heat suffocated the travelers, the sun merciless, beating down on their backs as they trudged forward. Water became scarce, rations dwindled, and exhaustion set in. Oxen collapsed from the brutal conditions, their bodies baking beneath the desert sun, leaving families stranded and struggling to move forward. Wagons sank into the salty earth, forcing men, women, and children to abandon precious supplies just to lighten the load. Some families began to fall behind, unable to keep pace, their fate uncertain. It was here, in the heart of the desert, that the cracks in their journey widened into gaping fractures, transforming their expedition into a slow, agonizing march toward catastrophe. The relentless heat of the Great Salt Lake Desert bore down on the Donner, Reed party, pressing them into a slow, agonizing march through an unforgiving wasteland. The sun, merciless in its intensity, scorched their skin, baking the earth beneath their feet as dust rose in choking clouds, coating their clothes, their hair, and their lungs with a dry, suffocating layer of grit. The vast expanse before them stretched endlessly, a barren sea of salt and sand offering no shade, no mercy, no relief. The oxen, once strong, now staggered, their bodies trembling beneath the strain, hooves cracking against the parched ground. Tongues, swollen and dry, lolled from their mouths, their breaths coming in desperate, shallow gasps. One by one, they began to fall. First, a weakened cow, collapsing onto its side, letting out a low, guttural moan before growing still. Then another, its legs giving way beneath it, pulling its wagon down with a heavy, splintering crash. Cries of distress filled the air, families rushing to salvage what they could, but every step forward felt heavier, harder, their bodies growing weaker. Thirst taking hold like a vice. The wagons, once sturdy lifelines to California, were now burdens, dragging deep grooves into the cracking earth. Wheels snapped beneath the weight, axles twisted and failed, forcing pioneers to abandon precious supplies in their desperate bid to keep moving. Clothes, tools, even food reserves were left behind, scattered across the desert like remnants of a failed dream. Men, once filled with ambition, now walked in silence, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Women clutched their children tightly, shielding them from the worst of the sun, whispering desperate reassurances they barely believed themselves. The weaker members of the party began to lag behind, their steps slowing, their bodies wilting in the oppressive heat. Some never caught up. Tension cracked through the group like a lightning strike on dry earth. Reed, once a confident leader, now faced growing resentment. His wagon, laden with unnecessary luxuries, had been a source of bitterness. But now, with water running low and tempers frayed, accusations flew. Recklessness, arrogance, selfishness. Arguments erupted. Voices raising, hands clenched, distrust growing. Then came the breaking point. The Snyder incident. A moment of rage, a fatal clash. And Reed was banished, forced to leave the group, alone in the wilderness. As his figure disappeared into the heat, haze horizon, the Donna Reed party marched forward, fractured, broken, without realizing that their suffering had only just begun. The fragile unity of the Donna Reed party had begun to unravel long before the Snyder incident. But that moment would become the breaking point. Weeks of exhaustion, suffering, and brutal conditions had left every traveler raw with frustration, their tempers short, their patience long gone. The failures of Hastings' shortcut had drained their supplies and their spirits, and with every step forward, the cracks in their leadership widened into deep fractures, threatening to split the party apart. James Reed, once a visionary leader, had now become a figure of resentment. His lavish wagon, stacked with unnecessary luxuries, had been a sore point from the beginning, a symbol of his perceived arrogance, privilege, and disregard for practicality. Many saw him as entitled, believing he cared more about his own comforts than about the group's survival. The strain of the desert crossing had pushed tensions to the brink, and when Reed confronted Teamster John Snyder over a dispute, the inevitable happened. Violence erupted. The confrontation was quick and brutal. Snyder, enraged, lashed out at Reed, striking him with a whip, the raw leather cracking against his skin. Reed, cornered, pulled a knife and struck back, plunging the blade deep into Snyder's flesh. The Teamster staggered, grasping at his wound, his face twisted in pain before he collapsed, lifeless, onto the earth beneath him. Silence fell over the party. A single death in the wilderness carried weight far beyond the act itself. It was a moment that shifted the balance of power, a wound that would not heal. The group gathered, arguing heatedly about Reed's fate. Some defended him, claiming it was self-defense, but others, blinded by anger and exhaustion, saw it as murder. The final verdict was not death, but banishment. Exile into the unknown, with nothing but the wilderness ahead. Reed, now an outcast, was forced to leave, stepping away from the wagons alone. His figure disappearing into the horizon, uncertain if he would ever see his family again. With their leader gone, the Donner Party pushed onward, fractured, broken, without realizing that their suffering had only just begun. As October arrived, the towering peaks of the Sierra Nevada loomed ahead, their jagged summits blanketed in the first hints of winter's arrival. The pioneers, worn thin by their journey, saw the landscape not as a threat, but as a promise. California lay just beyond those mountains, a final obstacle between them and the land they had spent months chasing. Though wary, they still carried hope, believing that if they could cross the Sierra, they would finally reach safety. They arrived at Truckee Lake, now Donner Lake. Nestled between the rising cliffs of the Sierra Nevada, a place where the terrain was harsh yet manageable, a place where rest seemed necessary before making the final push forward. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted, was that the Sierra Nevada was about to turn against them, trapping them in one of the most infamous winters in American history. The Donner Party reached the Sierra Nevada in late October, weary from the weeks of brutal travel, yet still holding on to the sliver of hope that lay just beyond these towering mountains. The landscape before them was an imposing wall of jagged peaks, standing like silent sentinels, their summits already dusted with the creeping arrival of winter. The air had shifted, growing colder, sharper, sending whispers of warning through the pine forests that lined the rocky terrain. Truckee Lake sat nestled within the basin, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the overcast sky above. For a moment, the pioneers felt relief, believing they had reached a place where they could rest, gather their strength, and push forward with renewed determination. They had been delayed, yes. Hastings' shortcut had cost them weeks of valuable time, but still, they believed they could make it through the pass before the worst of winter arrived. But winter was already here. The first snowfall came suddenly, silent flakes descending from the slate, grey heavens, landing gently at first, a mere dusting on the ground, clinging to their coats, settling in the crevices of their wagons. There was no panic yet. The snow felt light, manageable, nothing they couldn't push through. Then, another storm came. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches, sending gusts of icy air through the cracks of wagon covers, into the bones of the exhausted travelers. The snow deepened, thickening in layers, blanketing the trails, the lake, the escape route west. They tried to press forward, urging their oxen to pull the wagons through the rising drifts, but the wheels sank into the snow, refusing to turn, the animals straining against an impossible weight. Then came the final blow, a blizzard. The mountains sealed shut, the pass disappearing beneath a white fury of snow and ice, leaving the Donner Party trapped, stranded, and unaware that they had just entered the first chapter of a nightmare. Food supplies began to dwindle, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and fear grew like an unwelcome guest in the corners of their minds. And the snow kept falling. The storm never stopped. When the first blizzard roared through the pass, the Donner Party clung to their hope, believing that it would pass, that they could wait it out and move forward. But the second blizzard came stronger than the first, and the third buried them alive beneath endless drifts of snow, sealing them in a frozen tomb with no escape. At first, they fought against it. They tried to move, pushing through the knee. High layers of fresh powder, dragging their bodies forward inch by inch, but it was impossible. The wind lashed against them, turning the cold into knives, slicing through their clothing, biting into their skin, leaving them breathless, weak and beaten. The food dwindled. Each day, meals grew smaller, portions more desperate, scraps of bread, thinning broth, and whatever remained of their dwindling supplies. Then the animals began to disappear. At first, they butchered the oxen, carving thick slabs of meat to sustain them. But as the weeks passed, the choice was taken away. The animals starved, their bodies too weak to stand, collapsing helplessly into the snow, their eyes glassy and lifeless. The survivors boiled tree bark, scraping the fibrous strands into bitter wooden paste, swallowing each bite like a punishment. Leather straps, torn from their wagon covers, were chewed for days, softened in pots of melted snow, stripped of every ounce of nourishment. At night, the babies cried, their voices thin, barely audible over the howling wind outside, their bodies frail, their mothers helpless to comfort them. And the blizzards kept coming. Inside the makeshift cabins, the air reeked of sweat, unwashed bodies, and quiet, growing despair. Silence fell more often than words, the weight of hunger dragging them deeper into exhaustion. And still, the mountains held them captive. The cabins, hastily built in the deep snow near Truckee Lake, became silent, frozen tombs, housing weary souls bound by hunger and despair. The men and women inside barely spoke now, their voices thin and worn, their bodies slumped against the wooden walls, too weak to rise for more than the barest movements. Outside, the blizzards continued their ruthless reign, howling against the wood, stacking layers upon layers of suffocating frost, sealing the group inside. No food, no warmth, no hope. The animals were long gone. Their bodies, once strong and vital, had either starved, been eaten, or died from exposure. Those who had meat left rationed their final scraps. The others gnawed on bones, boiled tree bark, chewed strips of leather softened in pots of melted snow. Babies cried in the night, their frail bodies too weak to wail with strength. Their mothers rocking them with trembling arms, knowing there was no nourishment left to give. Men sat in silence, their sunken faces barely visible in the candlelight, their minds fractured by hunger, thoughts darkening into corners none dared admit aloud. Then came the choice. 17 set out. They left the cabins behind, stepping into the blinding white hell with thin hope, and even thinner bodies. But the mountains did not grant mercy. Days passed, starvation deepened, and one by one they fell. The first to collapse was too weak to continue, a slow, bitter death beneath the endless snow. The second lay motionless for hours, until someone, desperate, picked up a knife. Human flesh became the only sustenance left. Each death marked a new grim moment. Another body consumed by those who remained. Survival now a war against morality itself. And yet, they marched onward desperate, hungry, lost. The 17 who left the snowbound camp carried the weight of impossible hope on their frail bodies. Starvation had already gnawed them into ghost-like figures, their muscles wasted, their faces sunken. But still, they walked, marching into the blinding white wilderness, chasing the promise of survival. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, indifferent to their suffering. The air was razor-sharp, slicing through their lungs with each shallow breath. The snow clung to their legs, dragging their steps lower and slower, their bodies burning with exertion despite the freezing cold. Then, the first fell. Weakness had sapped her strength for days, her steps lagging behind, her face vacant. No one spoke when she collapsed into the snow, her body motionless, swallowed by the storm. Days passed. Hunger deepened. Another dropped to his knees, his breaths ragged, his body trembling violently against the cold before finally falling silent. There was no burial. The remaining huddled together, the unspeakable thought gnawing at their minds like a second hunger. The choice was made, silent, grim. A knife cut through stiffened flesh. Human meat was torn apart, distributed among those too desperate to refuse. Each death became a grim moment, another soul consumed, another step into a nightmare they could never return from. Meanwhile, back at the camp, the horrors unfolded inches at a time. Bodies withered slowly, collapsing against cabin walls. Their life drained by the unrelenting cold, the long suffocation of starvation. Fingers turned black, flesh peeled away. Voices grew weaker until they ceased altogether. Babies cried softly, then not at all. The survivors watched death creep through their ranks, unable to move, unable to change their fate. And still, the blizzards continued. The cabins at Truckee Lake were no longer shelters. They were waiting graves. The wind howled through the trees, its frozen breath creeping through the gaps in the cabin walls, settling into the bones of those inside. The blizzards had made escape impossible. Time had lost all meaning. They barely spoke now, their voices thin, rasping, drained of the strength needed to form sentences. Each death came slowly, one by one, stretched over days, sometimes weeks, as starvation gnawed them into hollowed husks of their former selves. The first to die in the cabins wasted away quietly, their bodies curled against the wooden walls, their faces frozen in expressions of exhaustion, eyes half lidded in acceptance. The survivors watched, but did not weep. They had no strength left for grief. Children clung to their mothers, their faces sunken, lifeless, barely breathing. Cries faded into silence, their tiny bodies unable to fight against the creeping void of hunger. A man collapsed mid-step, falling heavily onto the cabin floor, a hollow thud against the wood. No one rushed to help. There was nothing that could be done. They sat in silence, listening as his breaths grew weaker and weaker, until they stopped altogether. Outside, the snow continued to pile higher, layering over the world like a suffocating shroud, burying any chance of escape. Then came the final crossing, the moment when hunger overpowered morality, when survival drowned every remaining shred of humanity. They did not eat out of want, but necessity. Despair guided their hands, not cruelty. A body was cut open, its flesh carved, consumed in silence. No prayers, no speeches, just guilt and hunger. Some refused, their minds clinging to the last fragile pieces of resistance. Others couldn't afford hesitation. The cabins, once places of family and hope, had become charnel houses where the dead fed the living, and the living barely resembled humans anymore. And still, the blizzards did not stop. The cabins had become graveyards, the walls bearing witness to suffering that no human should ever endure. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, weaving between the cracks of wooden shelters, dragging the cold into the bodies of those who remained. Hunger had stripped them of everything: dignity, sanity, hope. The dead were not buried. There was no ground to dig beneath the suffocating layers of snow, and even if there had been, there was no strength left in their bodies to do the work. At first, they refused. The idea was unspoken, its horror too great, though it loomed in every starving glance, every tightening stomach. Then someone made the first cut. There was no ceremony, no discussion, only the silent act of survival. A knife against frozen flesh, the sound of tearing, of fire melting the stiffness, of reluctant mouths opening despite the overwhelming weight of guilt. The taste was nothing. Ashes, grief, resignation. Some ate without expression, their faces hollow, their minds fractured beyond return. Others wept, the act consuming them with despair deeper than hunger itself. But still, the blizzards did not stop. Weeks passed. The world outside remained silent, and the cabins darkened with death. Then, footsteps, voices, the arrival of relief. The rescuers pushed through the frozen wilderness, expecting weak survivors, desperate souls awaiting help. Instead, they found horror. Children sat alone in blood-stained cabins, their faces vacant, their bodies clinging to the last remnants of warmth. The survivors were barely human anymore, their skin grey, stretched tightly against bone, their eyes hollow and unfocused. And around them, the remains of those who had not lasted, the terrible evidence of how survival had been bought. The first relief party had arrived, but it was too late for some. The rescuers pushed through the frozen wilderness, their bodies laden with supplies, their minds set on saving those still trapped within the mountains. The journey had been grueling, the snow a cruel adversary, but they had finally arrived. They expected desperate survivors, waiting in anguish for salvation. Instead, they found a nightmare. The cabins stood silent, nestled between the towering snowdrifts, their roofs heavy with ice, their doors barely visible beneath the suffocating layers of frost. Inside, the stench of death. Children sat alone, their faces vacant, their limbs thin as twigs, their skin pale, and stretched too tightly over fragile bones. Their eyes held nothing, drained of the innocence they should have carried. Men and women barely looked human, their cheeks sunken, their hands trembling, their movements slow, hesitant, as if their bodies were too far gone to understand that help had arrived. Around them, remnants of those who hadn't survived, the evidence of what had been done in the name of survival. The rescuers staggered, their breaths caught in their throats, their minds unable to process the sheer horror before them. And still, not everyone would be saved. Some were too weak to move, their bodies already surrendering despite the promise of rescue. Others died just days before help arrived, their final moments spent staring into the cold void, their suffering stretched out over weeks of agonizing starvation. The weight of death pressed against the walls, lingering in the frost, settling within the rescuers' souls. They had come to save lives, but for many, it was already too late. The relief teams moved as swiftly as they could, pushing deeper into the frozen wasteland. But their arrival could not rewrite time. For many, they were simply too late. The cabins remained graves, their interiors soaked in silence and loss as winter's grip refused to loosen. Some of the survivors still breathed, but barely. Their bodies had wasted to skeletal forms, their faces hollowed by starvation, their limbs like brittle twigs, barely able to move even when salvation was finally within reach. Some tried to speak, but found no words, their vocal cords too dry, too weak, reduced to quiet gasps that barely carried through the frozen air. And others did not move at all. For some, death had come just days before the rescuers arrived, a cruel trick played by time itself, stealing life at the very edge of salvation. A woman lay near the entrance to one of the cabins, her body curled, as if she had simply fallen into a final sleep. Her hair was tangled with frost, her fingers stiff and twisted inward, clutching at nothing. A child sat near her, staring blankly at the wall, his eyes glazed, his body still, but alive. His mother gone. Her final moments spent watching the storm, perhaps dreaming of rescue, but never seeing it come. Inside another cabin, a man had collapsed beside the fire, his body hunched forward, bones pressing sharply against the thin layer of his skin. He had died sitting up, his head tilted downward, as if asleep in thought. The relief workers whispered among themselves, their faces drawn in horror and grief. No matter how far they had traveled, no matter how much they had prepared, they could never have been ready for this. Outside the cabins, a father's return was marked not by joy, but by dread. James Reed had fought through miles of ice and snow to reach his family, his heart hammering in his chest with the terror of possibility. He had left them months ago, forced away, when tensions ran high. But his mind had never left them. He had clawed for their survival in every way he knew how, gathering aid, pleading for help. And now he was here. But would they be? His steps faltered as he approached the cabin where they had been. No sounds greeted him. No voices called his name. He stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes darted around the dim interior, searching, desperate. Then he saw them. A cry tore from his chest. Relief and horror intertwined, a sound too broken to be anything but raw anguish. His wife, barely alive, stared at him with eyes full of something deep and unspoken. His children, thin as ghosts, barely reacted, as if their bodies had forgotten how to feel joy. And around them, in the corners of the cabin, lay those who had not survived. Blood had stained the floor. Flesh had been taken from bodies that should have been at rest. Reed did not speak at first. He only stared, his mind failing to process the full scope of what had happened in his absence. Survival had come at an unimaginable cost. He had come back for his family. But the family he had returned to would never be the same. James Reed stepped through the cabin's threshold, his body stiff from the brutal journey, his heart hammering with a fear he had not allowed himself to name. The relief party had arrived, but he had not yet seen them. His family. He had left them months ago, forced away from the group in the heat of an argument, and every moment since had been spent clawing for their survival from afar. But here, now, standing in the dim interior of the cabin, he could see the truth laid bare before him. His wife, Margaret, barely moved when she saw him. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched too tightly against her bones, her lips cracked from thirst, her arms weak as she lifted them slightly. An attempt at reaching for him, at acknowledging that she knew he was real. His children were there, but they were not the children he had left behind. Their bodies were frail, their eyes were hollow, and they did not run to him, did not cry out his name, did not lift their arms as they once had. When he returned from a trip, they only stared. The relief workers murmured behind him, shifting uncomfortably, unwilling to disturb the scene before them. The cabins held more than just starvation. They held the ghosts of those who had not survived. James saw what had been done in the name of survival. The remnants of those who had died were not untouched. The family he had returned to was one that had been forced to cross lines no human should ever have to face. He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He reached for Margaret, brushing his trembling fingers against her arm. She did not recoil. She did not cry. She only closed her eyes, a soft breath leaving her lips, the weight of relief interwoven with something deeper, something neither of them could name. And Reed could do nothing but hold her, hold his family, hold the pieces of a life that would never be whole again. The survivors, though freed from the mountains, would never be freed from the weight of what had happened. Word of the tragedy spread fast, first through whispers among the rescuers, then through newspapers, through towns, through the world beyond the Sierra Nevada. Disbelief was the first reaction. Then came judgment. Then came silence. Some people refused to believe what had been done, claiming it impossible, unwilling to accept that human beings, when pushed beyond reason, would do whatever was necessary to survive. Others condemned them outright, marking them as monsters, as something less than human, as if their own bodies would have fared any better in such suffering. The survivors became infamous. Some tried to move on, to build new lives away from the shadows of the past. Others never spoke of it again. Their voices swallowed by the weight of memory, by the guilt that could never be soothed. And the world, though it continued on, would never truly understand. Not the hunger, not the desperation, not the silence that lived in the hearts of those who had survived. The survivors emerged from the mountains as living ghosts, their bodies frail, their minds weighed down by the terrible truths they carried. But the world was not ready to receive them with kindness. News of their ordeal spread like wildfire. Whispers turned to accusations. Rumors grew into monstrous tales, and soon, the public's gaze was fixed firmly upon them. Some refused to believe it had happened at all. People argued in newspapers, parlors, and gathering halls, claiming that the stories of cannibalism were nothing but sensational lies, fabrications meant to twist suffering into spectacle. After all, how could civilized people do such a thing? How could men, women, and children descend into such depths? Others condemned them outright. The surviving families bore the brunt of that judgment. No matter how much they explained, no matter how much grief weighed in their voices, how hollow their eyes had become, there were those who saw them as nothing more than monsters, as people unfit to rejoin society. Some of the survivors never spoke of it again. They lived quietly, carrying the burden in silence, knowing no words could ever make the world understand. Yet the rumors grew, and soon history became tangled with myth. There were those who embellished the tale, twisting details into grotesque exaggerations. Some claimed that people had been murdered for food, that the dead had been butchered with relish rather than sorrow. Others whispered that certain survivors had hidden their actions, refusing to admit how far they had gone in their hunger, who had eaten human flesh, who had refused. Were some guilty of more than mere survival? There was truth among the rumors, but separating one from the other became increasingly difficult. And as years passed, the truth began to blur, swallowed by the weight of speculation. Some survivors moved on, burying the past beneath years of normalcy. Others carried the shame forever, haunted by what they had done, haunted by what the world believed they had done. And the story lived on, not just as history, but as legend. Rumors clung to the survivors like a second shadow, following them through every town, every whispered conversation, every newspaper article dissecting the tragedy. The truth of what had happened in the mountains was known only to those who had lived it. But that did little to stop speculation from weaving its way into the fabric of history. Some believed the cannibalism had been exaggerated, that while human flesh may have been eaten, it was only a last resort, a decision made in absolute desperation rather than any kind of savage intent. Others claimed that certain individuals had been more willing than others, that some had pushed for the act early, eager to survive at any cost, while others had resisted until there was no choice left. Did some kill for food? Or had every death occurred before the flesh was taken? The truth was difficult to pin down, buried beneath layers of shame, self-preservation, and the natural human desire to rewrite history in a way that makes it bearable. Names were whispered with accusation. Some had taken the flesh of their family members. Others had eaten, but would never admit it. A few survivors boldly acknowledged what had happened, refusing to let shame dictate the rest of their lives. Others denied, deflected, disappeared from public discourse entirely, and so fact and fiction blurred. It was no longer just a tragedy, it had become legend. The story of the Donner Party settled into the mythos of the American frontier, stitched into the tapestry of a nation built on exploration, risk, and survival against nature's brutal indifference. It was a cautionary tale, one whispered in hushed voices around campfires, pressed into history books with grim fascination, dissected in studies about human behavior, endurance, and morality. It spoke of ambition, the relentless push westward, the pursuit of opportunity despite warnings, the refusal to turn back even when disaster loomed. It spoke of hubris, the arrogance of believing one could conquer the wilderness without consequence. And, most of all, it spoke of survival, the fragile balance between civilization and desperation, between what is acceptable and what is necessary. The Donner Party's fate was no longer just their own. It belonged to history. It belonged to America itself. The story of the Donner Party did not fade into obscurity. It became woven into the fabric of American folklore, passed down in whispers, studied in history books, dissected in classrooms, adapted into countless retellings. It was not merely a tragedy. It was a testament to the brutality of survival, the arrogance of ambition, and the thin line between civilization and desperation. To some, it was a cautionary tale, a warning against hubris, against pushing forward, without heeding the dangers of the world around you. The party had ignored warnings, had dismissed dangers, had trusted too much in their own ability to to conquer the land. And in the end, the land conquered them instead. To others, it was a testament to endurance, to the unwavering instinct to survive, no matter the cost. It stripped humanity down to its most primal essence, revealing a truth that society tries to ignore, that desperation can push people to do the unthinkable. But beyond its lessons, beyond its reflection of human nature, it lingered as something more, a legend, a ghost story, a piece of the American psyche that could never be erased. And even today, the land remembers. The site of the tragedy, now called Donna Lake, rests beneath quiet skies, towering pines, and the eerie stillness of history. Tourists visit, unaware of the weight in the air, the whispers buried beneath the soil, beneath the snow, beneath the trees that once stood witness to suffering beyond imagining. The lake reflects the mountains in its peaceful surface, but beneath that glassy water lies the memory of the lost, the forgotten, the desperate. The trees sway gently, their branches casting shadows that stretch across the ground, a silent reminder of those who once walked here and never left. Though time has moved forward, the land holds its ghosts close, and those who stop to listen might still hear the echoes of a story that will never truly fade. The trees sway gently in the cool evening breeze, their branches whispering over the still waters of Donna Lake. The world has moved on. Modern roads carve through the mountains, cars hum along the highway. The sounds of civilization echo where once only the howling wind and the desperate cries of the starving could be heard. But the land remembers. Beneath the towering pines, beneath the packed earth, beneath the quiet surface of the lake, the past lingers, unseen but never truly gone. The soil holds the memories of those who once fought for every breath, every step, every hour of existence in the heart of winter's cruel embrace. Visitors come and go, taking pictures of the serene landscape, unaware of the ghosts that linger. The cabins are long gone, the suffering buried beneath years of snowfall and the march of time. But for those who pause, for those who let the silence settle in, something ancient still hums through the air. Not an echo, not a sound, just a presence. The whisper of history that refuses to fade. And as night falls over the lake, the water darkens, the shadows stretch, and the trees stand as silent witnesses to all that once transpired. For the world moves forward. But the past never truly rests. While this narration strives to remain as historically accurate as possible, some details have been lightly dramatized for atmosphere and immersion. Our goal is to create an engaging, time history experience while staying true to the real events that shaped this harrowing story. Now, close your eyes. Let the quiet wrap around you. The night is peaceful, and it holds no hunger, no desperation, just the steady rhythm of sleep pulling you into its embrace. Rest well. Tomorrow is another day,